I think we're ready to roll.
Yeah. Okay. 8:04, we're rolling. All right. Good morning, all, and welcome to your bi-monthly mandatory reporting task force meeting. Great to see everybody again. Happy New Year. I missed all of you at our last session, so it's good to be back. And with that, I'll go ahead and start roll. If you'll just say here as I call your name, that would be fantastic. I'll start with Dawn. Dawn Alexander. Okay, Yolanda.
Here.
Good morning, Yolanda. Kevin.
Here.
Hi, Kevin. Sam. No Sam yet. Carlos. Carlos Castillo. I don't see him yet. Ashley. I know Ashley is busy in the legislature, and so she is not here. She may have a sub. Jill Cohen.
Morning.
Good morning, Jill. Michelle Dossie. Jessica.
Good morning. I don't
Hi,
have a
Jessica.
kid who got sick but the Capitol got me sick. So I'm just gonna be off camera today because I got the Capitol ick.
No fun. Feel better. Tara. No?
Did you say Sarah?
No, I said Tara Dockstader. But we will say, I know you're here now, Sarah. Ida.
Here.
Great. Jennifer Isle.
Good morning.
Good morning, Leanna. Zane, I said hello to you earlier.
Good morning.
Nate Halpern. Adriana. I'm not doing very well today. Lori. Lori Jenkins, no. But I do see that Dawn is here. Hello, Dawn.
Hi.
Shayna. Gina
Mc-
Lopez.
Oh, no.
Whoops. Shauna.
Here.
Hi. Kristen.
Gina, I'm here.
Oh, Gina's here. Great. Kristen Menz.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Michelle Murphy. Margaret, we said hello earlier. Hello. Colleen O'Neill. Sarah, we already said hello to you. Rashawn, we said hello to you and thank you for the Dolly trivia. Casey.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. My friend Kathy Wells, good morning, is here.
morning.
Donna Wilson, I believe I saw you on my
Yep.
screen.
Good morning.
Hi, Donna. Kelsey. And Jade.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Jade. All right, that should be roll call. Moving on to our procedural issues, I am holding in my
Oh, I'm
hand.
so sorry, Stephanie. I'm here. I just jumped on a little bit late.
Great, welcome. Nice to see you. Thanks, Adriana. Looking at my meeting minute and my meeting recap from January 10th of 2024, all of you should have that in your possession and have had an opportunity to review those two documents. Starting first with the meeting minutes, are there any edits or changes?
Not shockingly, my last name was spelled wrong in the minutes in the first and last page, but that was my only thing to mention. Otherwise, looks great.
Thank you for raising that, Sarah. We will take care of that. And any other edits to those meeting minutes? Okay, if we could have a motion and a second to approve the meeting minutes of January 10th of 2024, please.
I'll move.
And that was, who was that? I'm sorry.
Margaret Ochoa moved.
And this is Kathy, I seconded.
Great. Is there anybody opposed to the passage of those January 10th, 2024 meeting minutes. I'm hoping it's April, that's all. All right, I see no opposition to the passage of those, so thank you. Moving on to the same process for our meeting recap. Are there any additions, changes, corrections that you would like to make to that document? Okay, I see none. If we could also have a motion and second then to pass that meeting recap.
I'll move again. This is Margaret.
Thank you, Margaret.
I'll second again, this Kathy.
Excellent, Kathy Wells. All right, is there anybody opposed to the passing of the meeting or the meeting recap?
No, but this is Gina. I would like to abstain from both because I
Okay,
wasn't here. Thanks.
great, fair enough. Thank you, Gina, for letting us know that. All right, then that document will also be approved and passed. I believe that is the extent of my very large responsibilities here. And I will turn it over to Jordan.
Thanks, Stephanie. And then just for the record, I wanted to note Carrie's comment in the chat that she'll be filling in for Michelle Dossi today as a proxy. And I think I just saw Ashley Chase join as well. So good morning, everyone. Happy very early Wednesday morning, and the sun is out and it's a great day to do some language and some statutory analysis. So I'm pumped. I hope you are as well. So we're going to dive back into the definition of neglect, carrying forward our conversation from our meeting on the 10th. We have comprised our responses, the 16 responses we did get from the survey. We'll be reviewing those. And we're going to go provision by provision, really looking at the feedback that we got overall and generally. I know that Doris and Trace are going to walk us through what we saw in the survey in terms of general opposition or support for each provision. We're going to walk through, get additional feedback, and then we're going to wrap this up today. So we're going to take your feedback. Today's the day to make notes, to let us know where you feel. And then Brian and I are going to take that back and start working on language for the final report, which we will revisit later this year once we start reviewing final recommendations going forward. So today is kind of the end mark for the work on this definition. After today, we're going to move into our discussion on the standard for reporting. So if you recall, in November, Brian sent out a memo regarding standards for reporting through a 50-state analysis. And this issue was originally raised by Jade, and it has to do with that mechanism in our law that leads to a report by a mandatory reporter. So we've looked for language such as reasonable, reason to believe, reasonably, has cause to suspect. We've gone through state by state and have looked at what other states are doing, compared it to Colorado. We're going to move through that discussion very similar how we move through this discussion about the definition. Prior to next meeting, we're going to resend out that memo that Brian produced. We're going to do another survey. What do you think about addressing this? Which states do you like the most? Please provide language. I really want to stress the importance of those surveys and participation in those surveys because they set the foundation for how we do these conversations. So if you're seeing language come up, we're basing it on that survey, those responses, and where that feedback is coming from. So they're really, really crucial that we do, particularly as we get going and we're asking you to pick out certain states that you like. We're going to start there. From there, we're going to do similar to what we did last time. We're going to have a general discussion as we move through kind of theme by theme on where we want to land. Then our team will take that information back, do a draft recommendation for you to review. And then similar today, we're going to ask you to look directly at each portion of that proposed recommendation, note your position on support or opposition, and give feedback where appropriate. So we're going to clip through. At the end of February, I just want to note that's going to be where we wrap up both of these discussions. We'll revisit everything later this year once we start reviewing final language and recommendations. After February, just as a quick reminder, we're going to start working into our subcommittees. So if you look at that roadmap document that we looked through last time, that's still in the folder, and I'll transfer that over to the most recent meeting minutes, you'll see how we're going to start breaking into those subcommittees as well. So again, please start thinking about where you may want to land as we divide into those subcommittees. Doris, Trace, and I may be asking some folks to move to make sure we have an equal division, both numerically and in terms of expertise, experience, and lived experience. We want to make sure that those groups are equally divided so we can work through those things. Any questions on the general roadmap and how we're going to proceed today and into February? I know I always come in so hot with the roadmap and the items, so feel free to slow me down. Okay, great. I will carry that roadmap over. Of course, we're always here for procedural questions. And with that, Doris, I think I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. So as Jordan mentioned, we're going to walk through the content on the specific provisions as well as regarding neglect, as well as the clarification. So we will highlight some of the themes that we got in the comments from the survey, and have what we hope is and strongly believe that we will have a robust conversation around components of each of the provisions, things that you like, things that you didn't like. We want to try to make sure that we maintain the container to try to get the language as precise as possible so that Jordan and Brian have clear guidance on what changes to make to the provisions as we move forward. So we're going to take them one by one, and we will lift up, again, some of the themes that came from the survey, and then we'll invite some conversation to get greater clarity so that we can continue to iterate on what will become the recommendations from this body. So we've pulled out the language and then comments for each provision. Jordan, I think, is going to share a screen so that for those of you who are visual can see the language on screen as well as some of the comments. I'm not going to read through all of the comments, but we'll highlight some of the themes that came out again, and then invite some discussion. All right, I think we're ready to go, Jordan. All right, that is, I don't know about everybody else's eyes, but real small for my eyes. Maybe if you close the side, and then can you make it a little bit bigger? Can folks see that now? Reasonably. I see Stephanie like, yeah, maybe. I'm like, I need to put glasses on. So again, we're going to take the characteristics first in defining neglect, really those exceptions, and then we'll go into the clarification, which I think for many of you will feel like sort of that guidance that has been named as a specific opportunity in assisting mandatory reporters in when it's appropriate to make a report. So this first characteristic is around indigence. And the language here is amending CRS 19.1.103 to specify that a child shall not be found to be neglected or abused solely due to the following characteristics: parental or guardian indigence and other conditions of financial difficulty, including but not limited to poverty, the inability to provide or obtain clothing, food, shelter, medical care, dental care, home, or property repair or child care. And some of the feedback that we got in the survey included that this language was too broad. This idea of really not liking that including but not limited to comment. And then we'll ask folks to come off mute and sort of explain a little bit more about their thinking. This idea that as long as a child is not being subjected to psychological and or physical harm, adding medical and mental health care to this particular provision. Not sure the other clauses regarding the exceptions are required. Again, trouble with this solely due to is concerning this belief that a child can be neglected when a parent is unable to provide basic necessities such as food. And also again, reiterating that the definition of neglect should include instances where basic needs cannot be met regardless of any blame or fault. So the way that I read that is not really wanting to carve out an exception for indigence here. And want to give the caveat that I don't think this belongs in 19.1.103, but in 19.3.103. Jessica would love to have some discussion around there. So I want to open the floor to focus more on the language, and then we'll ask Jessica, you to chime in on where you think this provision most appropriately belongs. And then Jordan is going to take notes so that she can combine the survey notes with the notes from the conversation today. So I want to just open the floor. Sorry.
Sorry, as I'm taking notes, it'll be really helpful if people just identify themselves because I have a limited visual, so I can make sure I'm very clear on who is stating what.
Awesome, thank you. So as you come off mute to share your comments, please state your name and organization that you're representing.
I'm happy to go first. This is
Right,
Carrie
thank you, Carrie.
Gillett. I'm the proxy for Michelle Dossie. So just in reading kind of the notes that Michelle had sent me, I think she had responded to the survey in reference to the word solely. And I think kind of from a DHS perspective, it is really important to have that in there because we're really talking about those indigent families. And poverty isn't necessarily a child abuse or neglect allegation. I think really solely is a parent is unable to. I do think there's a difference between parents not willing to receive this information or willing to do it, but just because they don't have it due to their poverty status or their indigent status doesn't necessarily mean that they are abused or neglected. It would be more of like a resource or a prevention type need.
Awesome, thank you, Carrie. So really, you know, kind of really liking that use of the language solely here in this definition, that if there's nothing else, and this is all we're talking about, that's not abuse or neglect. Thank you. Jennifer?
Jennifer Isle. I'm going to disagree with that just a little bit. I have seen in many situations where putting the word solely in is simply an invitation to find another reason. So I don't know if that's a training issue instead of a definitional issue, but I worry that anytime we say, if it's just this, then you don't need to make a report, and the reporter feels that the financial difficulty is impacting the child and they really believe it's neglect, that they're going to come up with other reasons to report, and this is not going to have the impact we'd like it to.
Awesome, thank you, Jennifer. And then Kevin, I see your note, and Leanne agreeing with that. I think we want to. What'd you share? What'd you shake your head for, Jordan?
I'm catching up to the chat because I can't see it as we're typing.
Oh, I got you. So Kevin, and I can tell you real quick.
Thank you.
Gina from CCASA said she agreed with that. Kevin Bishop also agreed. And then Leanne Gavin also agreed. And I think we can come back to this this topic around reporters potentially finding other reasons in the clarifications, and maybe have some additional conversation around you know, whether the clarifications are sufficient in helping to close that gap. Ashley, then Jessica Dotter, then Zane.
Sorry, morning voice. I actually am back. I like the word solely in here. I think I totally can hear what Jennifer's saying, but I think if somebody is intent on filing on a family, it doesn't matter what words you put in there, they're going to find whatever they want to find. And so I do think that's a training issue. But that word solely focuses it on, it can't just be this, but if that's one piece of a bigger puzzle and a child really is in danger, it allows you to take action. So I feel like it's threading the needle nicely, especially when you look at some of the other feedback where, you know, like I think number 7, I think that word solely kind of helps you navigate the concerns there. You know, if a child can't eat, that's just not child welfare, that the family needs help, but it's not through child welfare. But if the child isn't eating and there's severe medical needs, and, you know, that's due to not only financial difficulty, but maybe some other kind of issue, like then you start to need to be able to do something. So I just think solely has the right sort of focus.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. And I think as we think about moving from this language, just like really technical piece, to recommendations, including, sort of thinking about what other things might be necessary in the recommendation, to make it possible to have an exception for financial needs, for instance, and being able to connect kids and families to the resources that they actually need, when it's not child abuse and neglect, it's some other thing. Jessica, and then Zane.
I agree with Ashley. I brought this up at the last meeting, but the only reason that not only, but one of the primary reasons I feel comfortable supporting these exceptions is due to the word solely or some iteration of that in and of itself, one of the two. For the same sort of reasons Ashley said, in terms of providing, discretion to workers and mandatory reporters. And again, we got to understand, I think that depending on where it is in the statute, it's going to apply to a lot of different people and not just mandatory reporters. So I feel pretty strongly that it should remain in if we're going to have the exceptions. And I think that's in line with what most of the other states that we reviewed had some sort of terminology like that.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. Zane, and then Jade, if you could, we see your note in the chat, and if you could come off mute and on camera and sort of share a little bit more of your thinking, that would be helpful after Zane goes.
Thank you. I almost feel like I'm a voice of dissension here, but I guess what I'm struggling with is the language that we're defining for mandatory reporters versus the systematic response. And I'm having a hard time kind of walking myself through these scenarios when we talk about how we're defining things, because I don't necessarily know about mandatory reporters finding other things to then report on if we limit them. I'm almost worried about mandatory reporters not reporting because they think they're making decisions based on the definition that we created. And I'm worried that sometimes we might put children at risk because if we're not careful now, we may define something with an exception that could harm a child down the road. And so that's where I'm coming at this, and I'm having a really hard time in my brain, and maybe it's just the way it works, which is no one's problem on this call. But I want to see us define this in a way that still makes sure that children and families get the services they need. And it really was alarming to me when we started throwing in the medical stuff, because again, I think in Colorado, if you're indigent, you should have medical care. That's what Medicaid is. And so again, my question to this task force is, who's taking the lead here? Because I'm pushing hard that needs to be the Department of Human Services. They exist in every county. We don't have resource centers in every county. It seems to me like I can't answer these questions without understanding first where is this landing for children and families. And I know I'm not saying it has to go to child welfare, but there's other departments within the Department of Human Services that could filter these calls in a way that still give me comfort that we're not going to set up a child but definitionally by not being careful now, because again, we still don't have a landing place. And I know our job isn't maybe not that broad on this task force, but I feel like I can't answer these questions until I have a better understanding of walking myself, through what happens to children if they're living in a car, if they have no clothing. I don't, as a mandatory reporter, I may not be in a position in my agency to say, oh, well, go here, go there. There's many mandatory reporters that are in different roles. And so again, I don't want to set children up to have somebody be off the hook because of a definition that then harmed a child later. For what it's worth, that's my concern in answering these questions.
Thank you for that, Zane. So I think that there is, and Jennifer, commented that she agrees that she feels like we're doing this a little bit backwards. We should be addressing the mandatory reporting. We should be addressing, I think, some of this other stuff first, and then mandatory reporting statute. Jennifer, do you want to come and voice over what you were sharing in the chat?
Sure. This is Jennifer Isle. To Zane's point, I think, I'm finding this really confusing and backwards because our focus is on mandatory reporters and mandatory reporting. And so it's unclear to me why we're talking about the abuse and neglect statutes first, as opposed to the mandatory reporting statute. That's the language that I expected to be focusing on, where I think if we talked about who are mandatory reporters, the language about known or suspected, and all of that first, and then looked at the abuse and neglect definitions, for me, that I'd be able to track that a whole lot better. But this feels like we're doing this in the opposite way. I hope that made sense.
I think that made sense. Jordan, do you want to?
Yeah, I can just kind of jump in a little bit just to, again, provide the context for how we got here. Again, really want to emphasize to everyone, this is like in response to the conversations we had that first year. So as you read in the interim report that we filed, and you look back on our conversations, you can see consistently we talked about this notion of narrowing that front door. This was a consistent theme when we came up and we were talking about this, and narrowing that front door. And Jessica, I think, will probably jump in on this. That mechanism in the law is the definition of abuse and neglect. If we want to narrow what's coming into the front door by mandatory reporters, we have to start with this definition. I just want to remind everyone that we're also coming back to the notion of warm lines. So thinking back to this roadmap that we're talking about, here's where we're going to do our best to create this alternative definition that might narrow that front door that we've talked about. That was the consensus of the group moving forward. Then we're going to build into this warm line. So then we're going to build into the training. So I know it's hard to keep all these concepts kind of in line as we're going to move through them, but I just really want to encourage people to kind of keep that roadmap in play. So we're going to build on here based on our conversations the first year. Then we're going to come into the discussion of warm lines, which, Zane, to your point, based again on those conversations we've had, would be the mechanism that this group has thought would catch everything else that isn't going through that neglect hotline. And then we're going to move into training on how to handle both for mandatory reporters. So not trying to dissuade anyone from their positions, but I do think that that context, I just want to keep in the forefront of everyone's thoughts as we work through this.
Thank you, Jordan. Jade, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So I was agreeing with Soli. I think it's an important inclusion. A couple of things that are coming to mind for me too. Some of the points we just heard is, these definitions, again, are the definitions that mandatory reporters are required to report on, as well as the definitions that drive child welfare decisions. So these are, really critical decisions. They aren't driving just one of those pieces. And so I think solely my thought, Zane, from a mandatory reporter perspective is, well, I don't know if it's solely or not. So my responsibility is to report. So I'm going to report. As a child welfare person, my responsibility is to determine whether or not it is solely that or it's something else. So I feel like that, that definition helps. And I guess maybe what the other thing I'd say from a mandatory report perspective is, if I'm just worried a family doesn't have food, then that's solely. But if I'm worried about all these other things, then I know that's not solely. And so I don't know, I'm really feeling like solely does help to kind of narrow a little bit. The other thing that I've really been struggling with is this idea of to what extent, like it's solely, they're not doing this solely because they have, they're unable or financial restrictions cannot provide it. But like, how far does that go when it still becomes abuse or neglect? Like, is there a place in which we can say, like, there is still a really significant impact to this child, or this child is not safe? And maybe this was the reason, but is there another consideration that we need to be looking at based on the totality of the circumstances for this kid now? And I'm wondering if by adding the word solely, it kind of allows us to look at those larger circumstances if there is something else going on with that kid or that family that we feel like we need to take into consideration.
That was very helpful, Jade. Thank you. Don, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Don Alexander with the ECEA of Colorado. I guess my frustration stems from the fact that irregardless of what the definition is, the Department of Early Childhood will not allow a professional to make a determination as to whether or not that criteria is met. If they don't get to decide if if they have any kind of like wonder, or if a new staff member puts a leg over a child on a napping mat, then it's instantly, you must report to the county. And so I'm just really hoping that as we land on definitions, that we will do a ton of education around that and support the workforce and people, mandated reporters out there in educating the departments that oversee them, so that that doesn't continue to happen. There needs to be individual discretion in that to really determine whether or not something meets that criteria.
Awesome. Thank you, Dawn. I want to see if we have, if Yolanda is on the call here today, because would love to hear from CDHS.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am on the call. Is there a specific question or just asking for just a general impression or response?
Yeah, just general impression, you know, as, you know, sort of you're hearing the discussion, how it's landing, any additional considerations that you're thinking about related to indigence that you want to voice over in the conversation.
I definitely hear the intention of trying to narrow the front door, and so that hopefully families aren't over-reported when it's like poverty or homelessness or a different type of issue like that. I think where my mind went for a moment was wondering, like, okay, if it is a resource issue, then where does the judgment come in about what efforts or what sort of reasonable efforts the family has made to address that resource? Like, that's where I think I would worry the slippery slope would be, because even if there's an exception put into the statute around narrowing the definition of neglect, I think there's still that potential bias that can play a factor in, you know, saying like, well, I know that the family has a food bank down the block from them and they don't ever go there. So therefore, I still believe the parents are neglecting the child by not providing adequate food or something to that effect. And so I'm just curious what other people's thoughts are as well, because, you know, we're also talking about, again, narrowing that front door into being brought to the attention of Child Protective Services. And I think there is some reality testing or reality checking that we have to do to know that you're never going to be able to legislate out of people's minds and hearts and bias and experiences and all of that, what they truly believe is neglect of a child. So that's kind of where my mind went hearing the discussion, because I hear the challenges that we're identifying, right? And trying to really create more clarity for mandatory reporters around what would constitute neglect, while also trying to not have families over-reported when it is really indigence or poverty or some other factor rather than neglect. So those are my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Yolanda. And I think to Jordan's earlier point, like, this is like looking at the legal definition is a component. We know that, you know, narrowing the definition of neglect, and thus we think the volume of kids and families that are reported to child welfare, to the child welfare hotline, only works if there's an alternative path. So we'll be talking about warm lines, and it only works if mandatory reporters have, you know, greater understanding of what should be reported and what might need additional conversation or an alternative path when we talk about mandatory reporter training. So I want to move on to that. We have a number of provisions to get through today. So I want to move over to the next provision. And if there's something that you're still sitting with, if you could put it in the chat, we'll save the chat. So if you could put it in the chat so that we can save that in the notes. All right, so we're moving on to characteristic 2, lack of resources and no relief offered. So getting into some of what Yolanda was talking about. So it was a nice transition point on this idea of a parent or guardian's inability to meet the needs of a youth is solely due to the unavailable of reasonable services, and no services for relief have been offered. So we're not talking about a circumstance where families have been offered services and they've chosen not to participate, which I know has been some of our conversation. Some of the feedback from the survey is, that mandatory reporters won't know if services have been offered. And so that presenting some challenges, this idea of limiting this to where services are unavailable or have not been offered. It should specify services appropriate for the family specific circumstance. Sort of going a little bit deeper in specificity in terms of services that actually meet the needs of the family versus services more broadly. I'm somewhat opposed because I'm not sure how a mandatory reporter could verify whether a family has been offered services. Again, that theme of just you don't have insight into whether or not a family has been offered services. Coming back to this language of solely due to, and thinking that we're missing points that we spend a lot of time discussing about barriers and accessibility. Gina, in just a moment, I'd invite you to come off and share your thinking on that particular note. Margaret's okay with the unavailable of reasonable services, and at Adriana like the language, or would recommend the language say, or no services for relief have been offered instead of and Jessica included the same caveat as above. Want to give the caveat that I don't think this belongs to this particular section of the statute.
Doris, can I jump in real quick?
Yes.
Before we go into this specific language, I'm wondering if I could pester Jessica Dotter to come on and talk about her location discussion, because I think that applies to everything, and it might be helpful context if we need to move that discussion and then come back into the specifics.
Yeah. Jessica?
Sure, yeah. So kind of to break it down, and Brian, jump in here if you afterwards, if you kind of can give your take on it. But the way that it's set up right now is the mandatory reporting statute refers to the definition, which I'll say the mandatory reporting statute, the failure to report statute, sits in Title 19, Article 3, Section 3, and these are nuanced, but they're important. It refers back to the definition in Title 9, Article 1, Part 1, Section 1, I should say, Part 1. The issue is that the definitions that we're currently looking at, we have 3 of them. We have the one that sits in Article 1 of Title 19, and I'll give you the kind of caveat. The Title 19 is the Children's Code, so it applies to all juvenile delinquency proceedings. It covers child welfare. It covers court-appointed special advocates. It covers records. It covers just a great amount. And so then, unbeknownst to me as to why, we have Article 3 of Title 19 that really starts to cover dependency and neglect provisions. And that's where we have the mandatory reporting statute. That's where we have additional definitions in Part 1 of Article 3 concerning definitions regarding neglected and dependent child. So we have a definition statute in Title 19, Article 1, Part 1. We have a different definition in Title 19, Article 3, Part 1. The big difference is the different articles, right? One's for dependency and neglect. One is for general provisions that apply to anything revolving children, including, like I said, delinquency, teen courts, child protection ombudsman, child abuse prevention, parentage acts, surrogacy agreements. Right now, we're talking about a definition that applies to absolutely all of those. If we focus in on trying to clean this up, because what we're handling, right, is that we have mandatory reporters and dependency and neglect folks all working with different definitions. And we focus in on saying we want these to apply to mandatory reporters. We can do that if we place that in Article 3, and we can say this definition applies to this article, right? And we can move it if we want as part of our recommendations. That's totally within our scope. So I think, right, that the content of it is what's key, but we can draft it in our recommendations to be where we think it should be in the right location so that it applies to the people we want it to apply to. Now, I mean, talking about how, yeah, right now, I think it was Jade who commented, you know, right now this applies to mandatory, we're talking about it very broadly as if it applies to mandatory reporters and DNN decisions, DHS decisions. If we want it to just apply to mandatory reporters, because that's our focus on trying to kind of limit the call outs, and then giving mandatory reporters another, you know, soft handoff option in their statute, we can do that per our recommendation. So I don't know if that helps, Jordan, if that's what you were looking for, but I think that I hope that's answering what you were looking for.
No, it does exactly. And just as some context for how Brian and I put this together, as you recall in our last meeting, we didn't have the discussion on location. Prior to closing, we asked everyone here to consider where this should go. So Brian and I drafted this broadly with the intention that if this group had the desire to narrow in, we can. So the location of this language is up for discussion as part of this group. Jessica, you've more eloquently put it than I ever could have. So thank you for coming on and doing that. But again, this is just that context piece that I want people to keep in mind as we're working through this and we're considering the scope of the impact. Sorry, Doris, I didn't mean to.
No, you're good. And then Jessica put another note in the chat, looking at the 3 definitional statutes to consider. So I think, you know, definitely at some point doing that crosswalk to make sure that there aren't inconsistencies in all the places where child neglect is referenced. Ida included in the chat that she supports changing and to or as identified by Adriana and Jill in this particular section. And Kathy is still sitting with, and I'd love for you to share more, Kathy, but this question of how we consider the impact on the child, even if it is a resource issue, if it substantially impacts the child, who is then responsible to protect the child? So I'd love for you to come off mute, Kathy, and just share your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I think what I'm wrestling with, and I apologize, I'm trying to process, and maybe it's a little bit in reference to the last section, so I don't want to take us back, but I think there are clearly times when the resources are not available, and it may not be, and I think this was a comment made in the previous section, was it may not be the fault of the parent or the person that's responsible for the care of the child. But at the end of the day, if this child, you know, medical is on the list, for example, so I'm bringing my medical hat, right? If this child is having, you know, in the ICU for poorly treated asthma or poorly treated diabetes, 2 of the things which we know create the greatest risk of death in children from neglect, and it was a resource issue, there still is, if those resources are not available, how do we get them to the right? And I think that Zane alluded to this a little bit earlier, is if they're not available, and I'm not saying that, you know, I think that obviously child welfare is going to reference some of this in terms of saying, is there an accountability and would that be necessarily removal? And I think that's, but I think for the purposes of protecting the child, which is why the statute is written, how do we reconcile that aspect, right? So that aspect of what's the impact of that lack of resource, even if it's not the fault of the caregiver. I don't know how well I articulated that, but that's the thing I'm kind of sitting with, trying to figure out that we don't inadvertently set up a situation where kids fall through the cracks because there are resource issues, but they're not getting their basic needs met. And that's how we do it in the medical field, is we say a child not getting their basic needs met.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kathy. I will, I have some like putting on like my child welfare professional sort of hat and just sort of thinking about that. I think one of the things that, that is a like an implicit part of this conversation is whether or not it is or should be the role of child welfare or something else. And I think that many, if not most of you on this call think that it should be something else to help families that are struggling to meet the needs of their children, be it for mental or behavioral health, be it because poverty related, be it because the parents themselves have a mental health or a disability issue, that the child welfare system is not without harm, and it should not be viewed as a panacea for all the things to address family needs, because one, that's not what it's designed for, and there is direct consequences to parents in those circumstances that may not be of their own making. And so you're grappling with that because you're centering the child as you should, and also the child welfare system does apply blame. And if there is a finding and the family has to formally become involved, that finding is against the parents or caregivers. And so like really thinking about what might be that alternative, I think is a component of the work that all of you will grapple with, and I think are still actively holding while you think about narrowing this definition. I do think that it is something that you should be holding, but also a separate question from what we're trying to resolve in this particular moment. But also just want to honor and name that I think that many of you are holding that while you're trying to think about, like, if we narrow this, and what does that mean for the child? It means that there has to be another way for kids and families to get services and supports to meet needs that are not of the parents making.
Well, and I appreciate that. And thank you for, Doris, I think you say that very well. And I think for me, the reason I probably sat with it, not because I think it's maybe just naming what I think I'm hearing some others and what I'm feeling for me and advocating for on behalf of kids in my role as a AAP, American Head Pediatrics representative. And, maybe it's that recognition that even as we grapple with this, whatever we come up with is not going to be something that is, like, someone actually pulled me aside yesterday and said, I understand you guys are talking about the definition. And I think there's no intention here to put something forward without completing the whole cycle of what the roadmap that Jordan has put together.
That's right.
I think a confidence that this group and a trust that this group needs to have, that once that is gone full cycle, if this doesn't feel okay, given what we've talked about putting in place, maybe it's that caveat that this doesn't really happen without knowing that there is an alternative. And then I think you're absolutely right. I think that, even the pediatricians that I'm sort of speaking on behalf of are going to say, absolutely, right? Like, if there's another way I can get the family their needs met, then I'm all for that. So I think maybe it's that, just reminding as we kind of continue to go through this, that we're going to get there. This is not going to be proposed in isolation until that
That's right.
happens.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I come back to, I'm going to say this last point, and I know Trace is going to ping me here in a moment that we're taking too much time, but I come back to this point that, like, it's not just that a child is neglected when we think about the neglect definition, it's that the parents or caregivers are neglecting this child. And so if we're not actually talking about the parents or neglect or caregivers neglecting this child because of this circumstance, then for me that's a helpful refrain. And then the last thing that I will say, I think the last thing I said was the last thing, is that all kids who need some kind of intervention are not being served well today. Part of that is because the net is too wide, and so there's not the ability to apply the level of precision needed to ensure that kids who are most at risk, for whom the child welfare system was designed, are able to devote their attention, because the net is just too wide. So I'm done with my soapbox. Gina, I see your hand up.
Yeah, and my comment is also, back to the written one that I was mentioning, which was, and I feel like I can like surmise it a little bit better in that I feel like we are assuming a sophistication of resources and our systems being able to like fully communicate with each other, to keep tabs on who's accessing resources, who's not, all of those, who's fulfilling those basic needs by accessing resources. I think we're asking, or we're assuming a lot of this communication going on between the two. I say that because working in this area, first of all, resources are very rare, very, very hard to find. And when you do find them, oftentimes they're not very helpful because they don't speak to our systems who are asking our families to fulfill this piece of like, this is a care issue for your kiddo. We need you to access this resource. Okay, well, we don't have it. We're going to have to go to maybe another community to get that. Okay, we've done that. Well, now you've gone outside of your system, your community to do that, because that's the only way we can find them. I say this because it not only exists for our families, but also for victims of crime. And when we do that, though, there's a lot of hang up in between the two to be communicating with each other that, oh, family, whatever, has come here and done this. They've been very successful in doing that. We don't think that this is a concern any longer. I just feel like we're asking and assuming a lot about how this is happening, where yes, we want folks to get to resources. And also I just really want us to have a realistic view of that not all resources and systems communicate with each other well, and they're not really always the best fit. And that I feel that our families are doing their very best to meet those requests of them and to try to access those resources. And lots of times, like, because there's this hang up between the two, communicating that, this family is seeking resources, is trying to like close this concern up for you, that because they're struggling with getting this reconciled, this family is going to sit in this like limbo of they're not making these efforts, and or we have to wait for these systems to finally figure out how they talk to each other, or these resources to be talking to each other. And so now this family is not only like under the spotlight for possible abuse or neglect, but they're making those efforts, but it might be for naught, because those things might not even be talking to each other. So now the family is on their own trying to like be that bridge in between, on top of probably all the other issues that they're facing. So that's kind of my issue around our previous conversations about accessibility and how that works and doesn't work around, especially like resource poor communities like we have a lot of here in our state. That's it.
Thank you, Gina. I want us to come back to, I appreciate this, really realistic and practical consideration for both how the systems would necessarily know whether and to what extent families are engaged in services, what those services are, and things like that, that are suggested in this particular set of language. I think that the question that is before the task force today is really around whether or not you can get behind with this general notion for each of the provisions. Figuring out what else needs to come alongside the statutory provisions is a separate question that we're going to tackle later. So in order to make this provision around not reporting on, or family parents or guardians not being neglectful, or child not being neglected in instances where there just aren't services available, or can you scroll down back to the exact language that you have here, Jordan? I don't ever remember if it's down or up, which direction you have to go. The inability to meet the needs of youth is due solely to the unavailable of reasonable services, and no services for relief have been offered. So whether or not, like, a mandatory reporting wouldn't necessarily just know this. We don't have to necessarily figure out today how to better enable mandatory reporters to have information to be able to answer this question. What we have to figure out is whether or not this makes sense in the instance where you're determining or recommending that a child is not neglected in instances neglected or abused solely because of a lack of available resources or the family not being offered services. Jade, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was having a moment of wondering if there might also be a recommendation related to adding a sub-bullet or a framing here around the fact that if any other concerns are present that meet any of the other definitions, that is still applies. And I mean, I know that sounds silly, but I think one of the things that I'm just wrestling with, still thinking about kind of Kathy's comment, is if there is something else in the definition of child abuse and neglect that is happening in that family, we don't want folks to feel like they can't report because, you know, they also aren't getting services or something like that.
Thank you for that. Okay, Ashley, I see your note in there of the of the various sections. This is the one that didn't make much sense. And then Stephanie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, as it relates to section 2, I would agree with Ashley. I don't think I understood or need that. Which brings me back to section 1, which is the section we're trying to move on from right now, right? But I just want to say, first of all, such beautiful insight from so many different people. Thank you for all of these thoughts. You've given me a lot to think on. I think as I look at this general concept, Doris, that you're describing, right? Like just generally, does this task force want to acknowledge, right, that poverty does not equal child abuse per se, right? I think that's the statement, at least for the past year, right? Folks have said over and over again, per se, it is not a determination of abuse. And I think Jessica Daughter makes a really wonderful suggestion that this could remain in the mandatory reporter bucket, right? That's an option which helps narrow the work that a reporter needs to do. But secondly, is there a way to frame it? I like the word solely, but to the extent that people are worried about impact, right? And I get that. If a child is so injured, right, or struggling because they aren't getting basic resources due to poverty, I feel like there's a way to work that in to this broader notion. And I'm sorry, I'm really struggling because I'm trying to come up with the language of what that could even be. But to me, it would be more mandated reporters may consider whether poverty, whether solely poverty exists and or whether there's greater impact. And I think if we get to greater impact, we do start going down a huge rabbit hole. But I'm going to stop talking because as I'm speaking, I don't think I'm saying anything concrete because I do not have language yet. I am going to keep working on it in my head.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. And I think that, I think that's a good reminder for us as well as you, the collective you, lift up, particular things that you're struggling with in the language. If there is alternative language that you have in mind, even if it's not like well formed, please do share that so that Jordan and Brian can continue to refine the specific language that reflects the thinking and conversation that we're having today. So Stephanie, I'm thinking it's a stay tuned. Stay tuned for some alternative language from you. Sounds good. All right, I think we'll move on to the next provision unless anyone has anything that like they're really sitting with and a burning comment that they want to provide in this particular section. All right. Can you scroll down just a smidge? So this characteristic is around unaccompanied and unhoused status. So again, we have this solely due to language, solely due to the following characteristics: unaccompanied or unhoused status of the youth and or their parent slash guardian. And some of the feedback that we got from the survey was that the welfare of the children should still be assessed. Whereas the child is not forced into emotional, physical, or questionable criminal abuse. So I think in part this question this gets into that second point gets into human trafficking in a way. I think there needs to be clarity if a youth is not under the care supervision of an adult, then how their circumstances might be impacted, their ability to get food, shelter during bad weather, showers, medical care, etc. I also think, I don't want to add anything to what you added. Oh, you do have, I was going to say, Michelle, I was like, this gets at potential risk for human trafficking as well. I don't think this language is necessary. The indigence clause covers the lack of housing for youth, which is not the sole basis for making a report. Stephanie added that. Gina added, why can't we just say unaccompanied, unhoused status of youth and or does not mean they're being neglected or abused. I love the potential word change there that you provided, Gina. I'd like to see an age limit or requirement added to this section. I think it should say unaccompanied status of a youth 14 years or older and or their parent guardian. I think unaccompanied youth should not be a basis, but have a hard time believing that an unhoused youth would not fit into what we generally deem to be neglected to the point of requiring system intervention. Jessica, thank you for adding that. So would invite some conversation, both in terms of reflecting on the various survey inputs and responses, and might have you thinking additionally or differently about your initial take on this provision, and then any other thoughts, suggestions for change language or overall sentiment around this language.
Are we waiting on being called on by hand raising?
I just now saw your hand, Chris.
Okay.
I had to scroll over. Usually it like pops up.
So, the only thing I would say, so I mentioned something earlier, and I think part of what gets me on a lot of this language that we're doing is if I'm advocating from a mental health perspective, I have my reasons. If we're advocating on a perspective of physical health, right? From a physician standpoint, we have our advocation of it. If we're doing it from a legal or a justice standpoint. And so again, I know there's a roadmap of everything we're entailing and mandatory reporters that thus will then encompass all of this, but there's still so much gray area. Like we don't have an emancipation law here for kids. We don't have the allowability for them to self-sustain themselves based on their circumstances of abuse or housing or neglect or homelessness. Or foster care, and so we deem what we feel is best for the child. And I think what we're not taking into account is how intelligent our children are now and the resources they have available to them, not necessarily from a standpoint of financial resources, but definitely more empowerment resources as far as mental health resources, hopefully health resources. Again, I recognize that's not all kids, and it depends on the parenting style that they're in or the home or the situation. And maybe this is too many Lifetime movies or something that I'm watching with a bad outcome, but I do feel that we do have these situations that meet criteria for neglect, abuse, all of the above, but then not necessarily by anybody's fault, just by situation. And again, the resourcing aspect of it. So it bothers me to pigeonhole us. We take a test to practice law or to practice what I do, but at the end of the test, like you never have that situation. We don't treat the same client the same way in every situation. And so I think that's what makes me a little leery about some of the language or some of the situations. If we write it up like this, are we stuck? So,
Yeah. Thank you for that, Chris. I will say that, and I don't know if any of you are sitting with this, but to me, the unaccompanied and unhoused status of a youth that is just out on their own is very different than an unhoused child or youth who's with their parent or guardian. They seem like two separate categories to me. So the area where I know I'm not a member of the task force, but the area where I struggle with this provision is it seems to couch the two together. And I'm struggling with that one. Okay, so I see in the chat, Ashley and Zane, agreement with what I just shared, and also Roshan. And then Don put in the chat, that a youth left at home without supervision, is also sort of, distinguished and not clear, I think is what you're saying, not clear in this language. Margaret and Kathy also agreed with my uninvited commentary. Stephanie, I think it's important to remember both the tangible and intangible effects of law provision. I think as another reminder to us, oftentimes we create awareness of an issue by flagging it in statute. Flagging poverty in a statute like those only provides a consideration for mandatory reporters. It doesn't take away their discretion to use their experience to make decisions. I think to Chris's point that, they're mandatory reporters and also professionals in their own right and in their own field. So, I think the expectation is that they would still apply their judgment, which may get back to some of the conversation about, finding other things to report on, even if the main issue is poverty. And then Carrie also noted that that they do seem, she agrees that they are separate scenarios.
Sorry, my hand is raised and it's hard to see in my background. So
I couldn't see it because it's
yeah.
blended in with, I think,
It's
your picture in
blending.
the background. Thank
Yeah,
you, Ida.
it's blending right in. No, not a problem at all. So I'm just really appreciating the roadmap that has been laid out for us, because it honors the fact that these are multiple perspectives that are housed in the same place, and these are the differing perspectives that are at the crux of the issues of mandated reporting. Because I think there's often sometimes we'll hear the sentiment, oh, well, we reported this, but nothing was done. And I think it speaks to the need for that feedback loop when nothing is done, when one of these factors applies. That from the perspective of the agency, they're able to articulate to the mandatory reporter, this was determined not to be accepted for assessment because of some of these provisions. Because I hear our partners in the counties really asking for there to be a clear definition that can help them dialogue with mandatory reporters as well when they're making some of these decisions, especially as we're thinking about narrowing the front door. So I'm just appreciating that the roadmap at this moment.
Awesome. Thank you, Ida. So I want to come back to this particular characteristic carve out on unaccompanied minors and or unhoused status, and just sort of like solicit any thoughts, feedback, particularly for those of you who did not respond to the survey. Any questions or concerns that you have. Michelle, I see your hand up.
Hey, apologize showing up late and then getting off topic just a touch. I will say I didn't respond to the survey. I went to do it this morning. It was gone. I had some questions and concerns about including these specific pieces, but I like the way you all did it here, making it clear that it's not on its own, and some of the qualifying pieces on the other end, or explanatory pieces around additional services, doesn't mean you don't do anything. I have a conflict with my member meetings every Wednesday, so I'm often late. Has this group talked about one of our biggest concerns from the mandatory reporter perspective in schools is that we have teachers and administrators getting charged criminally and or losing their licenses if they don't report. Has this group talked about some sort of safe harbor? Because I do think this makes it a little more complicated, although I think in statute it's going to go someplace else. But I just want to interject a conversation or a placeholder for a conversation around safe harbors for folks who don't report on a good faith belief that there was no abuse, right? So again, it's a little off topic, but it feels important for our educators.
Yeah, thank you. And that is one of the provisions in other states that we looked at. And sort of like getting to we're starting with like, what changes, this group wants to make to the definition of neglect and is reportable, as well as on the other side, on the child welfare side, what constitutes neglect in terms of a dependency finding. And there is a separate question, and so I appreciate you naming that. We'll capture in the note, but we will come back to the potential consequences and changes to what if a report is made or a report is not made on a good faith basis, what then are the consequences? And then Jennifer, I see your note in the comment around the importance of training, because most reporters are not child welfare experts.
One thing I would just add there, and then I'll go back on mute, is that even the training, I've done them, and I've done them with people that are really skilled, and we do scenarios and the whole thing, and they still in the day-to-day all too often, I guess, don't know it when they see it, or at least don't know what would trigger under current law an obligation to report. And so it's like, if we can, I just really want to lean into that safe harbor, because of the circumstances and the challenges that these folks are facing every day in this regard.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. All right, so I don't see any hands raised, anyone immediately coming off mute around this particular language provision. So we'll move on to the next one.
Hi, Doris, this is Gina. Can I just wanted to share a quick example, and it might just be very specific to our community, but I think it still plays in that our kiddos still they still go to school in our county, and they have responsibilities in the schools, and and with their departments there to make reports if they hear of anything. And this is that I just want to name this, right? And so we had two kiddos. One of the kiddos was with mom who is unhoused and had been couch surfing and had been living with different folks. In this particular home, there was a kiddo on kiddo sexual abuse happening. Both kiddos were under the age of 10. We don't have existing laws in our community to address sexual assault and sexual abuse involving children or adults. And so law enforcement was really at a loss in terms of, what type of support or resources they could give to this mom and kiddo that this happened to. But what law enforcement did say was, if anything, mom should be in trouble because this is not a very safe way for kiddo to be growing up couch surfing and things like that. And so then kiddo goes into school, right, in town, and then teacher maybe hears about these things going on, or kiddo shares this, whatever, they find out about this whole thing. Again, I just want to name that, these systems they're not always communicating with each other. There's more going on around the unhoused kiddo and parent. And yes, it's all going right back to poverty again. So yes, maybe we're back to the not solely, right? But I just want to lift that up, that like we're still in this place where I think we mentioned it before, like, you know, if one thing doesn't fit, then I feel like because folks who are reporters feel this obligation, responsibility, or this fear that they're going to get in trouble if they don't report something, because this is a very messed up situation. And it was, absolutely it was. But like in this situation, there was nothing, there was and still is nothing in place to have prompted some sort of, in my opinion, justice to what was going on there, and all of it tied to all of these facets we're talking about, the lack of resources, poverty, all the things, right? So I just wanted to lift that example up, that like, you know, wow, you know, when we're thinking about, you know, the safety of children, you know, mom thought she was doing the right thing and then inadvertently prompted this other comment about like, well, why are you allowing that to happen? Why are you putting your kiddo in such dangerous situations? I'm sure mom knows it's dangerous, right? But like, you know, are we going to hand her over a house, right? Like that's that. So anyway, I just wanted to lift that up. Just wanting to lift that up, that happens. It probably happens more than we know about. And I think about our educators and our folks in our county who probably do hear about these things, but they get to just like table it and just be like, well, we can't get into that community. We can't tell, you know, we can't do that. We can't do that communication. We can't ask what's going on. I hear that they do a child abuse and child fatality review out there in our county. And some of those kiddos include kiddos from our community, but when those come up when they do that, they kind of just skip on and then go to kiddos that are within their jurisdiction. And I'm saying, like, here in Colorado, we still have a group of kiddos who are not safe. And so I don't know what the answer is. I'm not saying, you know, this is the answer I'm looking for. This is the ideas that I have around. I just want to name that exists here in one of our corners of our state. That's all.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gina. And I think that so I'm not a great storyteller, but I love stories because I think that it helps us to be thinking about how then to play out, you know, sort of a provision with real life circumstances. And you know, does it have the, you know, or we had this conversation about, will it have the intended impact? Or are there some unintended consequences that we haven't thought about? So bringing in specific stories, I think, is helpful in doing that. Chris, I want to take your comment, and then we'll move on to the last provision before taking a break. Well, not the last provision, the next provision, and then we'll take a break. Chris?
And I just, like Gina said, the law wasn't written. This is what I was talking about before. We're working on a document that was created in 1963, and everything that we wrote the document on in 1963. Just be clear, I was not born then, so just putting that out there. But everything we wrote the document on, we have evolved, and we never could have expected that we evolve like this. And so the problems that we're seeing today, or the evolution that we're seeing, I mean, I deal with reunification and constantly. And so I'm dealing with the court system and the mental welfare of the child who refuses to reunificate with the parent. And yes, they're 12 and over and can make that decision, but not when they're being court ordered and they have trauma histories in their past. And so you're reporting the psychological abuse and nothing's getting done. Again, these are things that we didn't even think about in 63, 83, 2003. I mean, so what's going to be in the next 5 years that we're not thinking about that continues to evolve? And I think that, again, I have linguistically no idea what the language should be written to say that, but I think it needs to be a living, breathing document that recognizes that we haven't experienced it all yet, and it's still coming. You know, the things from COVID, the background, the backlash of everything else that's going on, you know, in the world affects what we're doing today. And sorry to take such a broad social work perspective on that, but the macro level really affects our ability to write this document. So
awesome. Yeah, I think that's an important reminder that you know, right now we're talking about you know, changes, statutory changes, right? And so the expectation is that we want to be as precise as possible. But I think as this task force moves toward recommendations, you know, there is an opportunity to potentially provide some additional touch points to assess for you know, sort of new dynamics in the environment or new considerations as well as impact. So not to sort of jump ahead, but I do think that part of the charge of this task force is to make recommendations that are very technical, but also to make recommendations that could allow for a room to account for just changes in this particular sector. With that, we're going to take on this, the last characteristic before we move into some additional considerations around disability status. So again, the same language around a child shall not be found to be neglected or abused solely due to the disability status of the youth or their parent guardian as defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so we have less feedback that was in the survey specifically around this particular topic. Again, this comment around it being too broad. And there is, Michelle provided some comment on whether or not there's any room to add something around a mental or physical disability that parents choose not to obtain or accept medical or mental health intervention and their right to do so unless it causes the child to be subjected to significant impairment or life-threatening circumstances. For example, if a child is diagnosed with ADHD and a parent chooses not to get, I'm going to add some language here, get medical care for them, it's not life-threatening, but versus a parent who fails to give a child insulin for diabetes, which is life-threatening. And then why can't we just say the disability of the youth or their parents' guardians does not mean they're being neglected or abused? There are a lot of judgments about parents, caregivers who are disabled being quote unquote good parents. So some of the comments that we received here, tracking the chat, Jill put in and would love for you to come off mute and share out. But speaking to others in her office about this language and recommending the definition of disability, that it has the same meaning as set forth in the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, 42 USC section 12101. It's and its related amendments and implementing regulations. So getting a little bit more precise in the reference in this particular section. And then Trace reminding us that we're going to take a break after this provision. So thinking I get a break, all of a sudden my throat is getting dry. So hang in there. So feel free to come off mute, raise your hand, and share out any thoughts, reflections, strong objections or affirmations to this particular section. We'll go with Jill and then Zane.
Just wanted to reference that this definition is already in 19.1.103, so we could cross-reference it. Just wanted to put that out there.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill. Zane?
I'm still struggling with the language, like Jill just said, is already written into the statute. I guess what I'm worried about is what problem are we trying to solve with this? And maybe I'm just not thinking. I'm thinking, like, if we say the disability status of a youth and or their parent as defined, you know, by the ADA, to what extent is a child not abused or neglected because the parent has a disability? So if a parent has PTSD and lashes out at the child physically because of some traumatic stress situation, you know, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around how that is supposed to help us with mandatory reporting. I guess I'm just not clear as to what extent, and I'm more concerned about the parent disability than I am the child disability. But you know, I just haven't seen where this scenario, I guess, in my experience has really risen. So I'm just open to hear what's the importance as far as this in relation to the parents' disabilities.
Jill, and then Jessica.
I mean, people report parents who are in wheelchairs because they don't think they can change a diaper. People report parents who have they hear about a diagnosis of schizophrenia, they call the hotline. So I don't think that generally, maybe the most sophisticated reporters who do the training and who are trained in all these matters might see how that is not a reason to call it in, but I think the more specific we can be in here, because we over-report people with disabilities, and then we over-file on people with disabilities, and then people with disabilities are more likely to have their rights terminated. So this is our opportunity to not over-report people just because they have a disability. Now, if you have a disability and you harm your child, we're not calling the case into the hotline because you have a disability.
Thank you for that, Jill. Yeah, I think the solely piece is really important here, and maybe it's solely because the child or the parent has a disability, as defined by the Americans with Disability Act, versus, you know, the child or parent having a disability, and there's been some behavior that suggests, using your example, Zane, that there's actually physical abuse. So the disability status is not what's being reported, it's the physical abuse. Jessica and then Stephanie.
That's all I was going to say, Doris. This is where the solely kind of comes in and puts a limitation on it's about the disability status is the key word, not, you know, anything that might then result from that disability would still be, I think, reportable. Thank you. But I appreciate using because I have those similar breakdowns and thoughts.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. Stephanie?
Yeah, as I struggle with this, I'm reminded of all the conversations we've had on disproportionate impact is what drove us here, right? And at risk of making my staff upset with me or anybody else on this phone, aren't we talking generally, especially as we talk about disabilities, right? Characteristics that are inherent to individuals that we don't want to make the basis for a child abuse report. Is it as simple as stating, right? The inherent characteristics of people, including race, socioeconomic status, gender, disabilities, shall not be the sole basis, right, for making a child abuse and neglect report. I mean, it feels like, as I'm thinking about it, we're trying to define neglect, but perhaps we should be addressing just head on what we're concerned about. And that is people with bias or inherent or explicit bias, calling it out, just saying these characteristics in and of themselves shall not be the basis solely for a child abuse and neglect report, and be done. It gets rid of the whole notion of redefining neglect throughout the statute. It gets away with the notion of impact on child, which I very much respect and share the concerns of my colleagues. But I don't know how we do that without starting to define, well, are there bruises? Are there marks? I just wonder if there is a simpler way to address our concern, which is don't make decisions based on how people look. I mean, in essence, right? I just throw it out there. I can be too simple at times in my analysis. So I give that for some thought.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephanie. I think that is an important point, and lots of folks in the chat agreeing with you. And I think that sort of arriving at that while walking through like each of these different subcomponents or these different characteristics, I think has been, at least for me, helpful in getting folks to surface the ones that they struggle with more or less. I think ultimately to get to like, is there a simpler sort of catch-all provision that could be used? Awesome. As folks look at their clock, Zane.
So I just want to be clear. you know, because I'm just trying to think this through, and I'm trying to think about my own experiences working as a child welfare worker, and then my experiences running CASA programs. And so, you know, I'm brought back when we talk about disabilities, I'm brought back to a case years ago that I had where I had a young boy. He was about 3, and his legs had to be amputated because of some medical issues. And even though he had prosthetic replacements for his feet, his mom was allowing him to walk without the prosthetic. So it came in as a child welfare call out of concern as to whether or not he could be damaging his feet by not using the prosthetics and walking around just on the stumps of his feet. And so I became involved as a child welfare worker. I went out to the home and, you know, assessed the situation, talked to the doctor. At the end of the day, we relied on the medical professionals to tell us that this child was not in any danger by walking on the stumps of the legs that he had remaining. And so we immediately closed the case. That's, you know, that was part of the assessment. We wanted to make sure, because we felt like calls were going to continue coming in, and we needed to make a decision as to whether or not you know, the refusal to use the prosthetics was child abuse or neglect. So once we consulted the medical professionals in this particular instance, then as calls continued to come in, which they did on this particular situation, as a Department of Human Services, we knew the answer. We assessed that situation. So I mean, that really was a case that was specifically open due to a disability when you think about it. But in some ways, it helped averted future issues because we were able to get in and assess that situation. And we knew when future calls would come in from caregivers, providers, whatever the case may be, that we could address that. So again, I think my reluctance in all of this is just to be cautious about any loopholes that we, you know, create as a result of the language we're using. And I appreciate everybody's perspective, and I'm learning, because again, I know there's things that sometimes don't pop into my mind immediately, and I ask the question, give me examples, and you've come through. But again, I just want to be cautious again about limiting any assessment that needs to be done, you know, because again, there could be a future determination or a future reason why that might be important, for whatever that's worth.
Thank you for that, Zane. Roshan, glad to hear it from you today.
Saving it all up. No, this is Roshan. I guess I'm thinking about, I mean, I appreciate the directness of just like, this is what we're concerned about. I also feel like that's in a lot of places already and it's not working necessarily, right? So I'm not sure if I would feel comfortable with us. And I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, so I appreciate people who have more of the legal background saying like, we're muddying up the waters, we're making it too hard. But I feel like if just saying to people, hey, like, don't be racist, don't be sexist, like if that worked, we wouldn't be having these conversations. So I think we do need to give people examples, because most people don't think that's how they're acting, or, you know, when they're behaving in that way. So I guess I don't want to lose like the reality of on the ground, people aren't gonna, like, if, you know, if there's like I think I love, you know, I love some kind of intro that says like, this is an important piece to consider in all of these definitions or whatever, you know, something like that I think might be great. But taking out some of the examples feels a little scary to me in terms of just, and I haven't worked as much in child welfare as most people on the committee. So you know, but in other parts of the system, it's just, it's so much a part of what we're describing that to kind of, yes, the simplification feels really important, but also it's like, if it was that obvious, we wouldn't need to be having this conversation. So I just don't want to miss the like reality of how hard it is we can't talk people out of it. We have to show them what the impact is in some way, right? Like just explaining to people. But I don't know, maybe I'm missing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a fair point. As an equity practitioner, being explicit is really important. So I appreciate you naming that, Roshan. Jennifer.
Hey,
Oh, wait, and you moved. Okay, there you go. You moved on me.
I'm shuffling around, doing that Zoom thing. I absolutely see Rashan's point. I think at that point, then we're talking about the person answering the hotline, right? We're talking about that screening or intake person who is going to be asking the questions to determine, does the department need to get involved? Does this require further anything? So ideally, it is really simple and straightforward. Like, don't report somebody because you have issues with their religion or whatever it may be. And then the screening process really has to be screening that out. And, we're not going to prevent people from making reports for the wrong reasons. I really want to make sure that whatever we create here, we're just making sure that where that net is narrowed is first at the reporting stage. We tell all these mandatory reporters, you don't need to worry about these things. The kids are fine, or making a report isn't the answer. But we really narrow it, I think, at that screening place where whoever's answering the hotline is asking questions that then screen that call out.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jennifer. I will say, just a couple of thoughts, reflections, also bringing in Stephanie's comment in the chat around the public policy changes setting both a tone and a culture. I think for sure guidance from the law informs what happens at the screening decision point. And also, part of the conversation that we've had all along the way is thinking about and talking about ways in which mandatory reporters could potentially route families differently and potentially engage differently with families, with parents when they notice that there's something that is awry. And so I think there is an opportunity to shift the culture around what to do when you notice that that a child or youth seems to have some needs. Like the example, and I know I'm taking up a lot of airtime, but the example of the child who was walking on their stumps and not using the prosthetic. Why wouldn't one of those reporters had a conversation with the parents to see if that was problematic, like if there was any medical harm in walking on their prosthetic? And so, like, I think this idea of having a conversation with families, with parents, with youth about what's happening to potentially determine whether they should be routed. Now, all mandatory reporters won't have the kind of relationship or time to be able to have that conversation, I recognize. But I think when we talk about the culture shift, the law is a part of that. The public policy piece is a part of that. The processes and procedures and guidance that happens in the formal systems, but also I think the ways in which kids, youth, and families are engaged is also part of that. And then Gina, I see that you put something in the chat wanting to argue that the example shared wasn't a report made about a disability. It was made about discomfort of able people who felt that the parent needed to make sure their kid shows up in the world as normal, even through their disability. Very interesting point. I think the parent doing the opposite is empowering to that kid who is going to have to navigate a world world not made for them and do so without shame. Again, there are so many judgments, othering and policing of parenting that have nothing to do with a child being hurt. So thank you for that, Gina. I appreciate that significantly. And then Kevin responded to Stephanie's note in the chat around the tone setting is also important when talking about adequately resourcing families versus letting people off the hook or allowing loopholes for mandatory reporters to somehow nefariously ignore or shirk their duties. So the two things have to come together. Adriana will take your comment. Yolanda, if there's anything that you're noodling over as you think about applicability to the child welfare system, and then we're going to take a break.
I just wanted to add one input. Doris, I do absolutely agree that I would hope mandatory reporters do have the relationship or the ability to have these types of conversations. I'm concerned about putting that in law, or because I know part of this is training mandatory reporters, but at the same time, I don't want to shift all of this burden or more burden to mandatory reporters to know things like what resources have you accessed? What, we have trained caseworkers who can recognize not only child abuse and neglect, but hopefully with some education and further training in that area as well of connecting resources. So I absolutely am mindful of the over-reporting and hoping that mandatory reporters can have that, but I am just a little hesitant in drafting these laws or going forward. Part of the complaints we hear is that mandatory reporters are confused and they need specific guidance. And so, I just hope that we're mindful that we don't want mandatory reporters to start doing their own mini investigations into these families or resources or whatever the case may be, simply because, that's a lot to take on. And that does actually kind of add more confusion to what they think they're already supposed to be reporting.
Thank you for that, Adriana. Bringing again us back to the practical realities of any potential changes to the law. Awesome. We're going to take a break. Are we thinking 10 minutes, Trace?
10 minutes, and then we'll talk through how much time we have remaining. I don't see any public comment right now, so I think we can take the full time. So
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, we'll come back at the 56. Thanks, y'all. That's your cue, Doris.
I think I'm handing you over to Jordan.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So before we move on to the additional provisions to consider, I wanted to bring back to this group and do a rough poll about heading in the direction that Stephanie suggested. There was a lot of agreement in the chat. I saw a lot of head nods. And the reason I want to bring back to this point is I do think we need to hit some kind of rough idea on what we're going to do with this language for us to head into those other directions on the roadmap. So great example would include, as we discuss warm lines, I do think it will be important for this group to know what we intend on moving into that warm line realm and what we intend to keep on the more traditional track. So I would like Brian and I to have some kind of general idea on whether or not we're okay in doing the more generalized suggestion that Stephanie put forward and moving there. We can always come back and discuss about where that language will live at a later date, but I would like to do a general poll if we're okay to head in that direction. And I kind of took down what you said, Stephanie, and I'll throw it in the chat right now. This is very rough. But in terms of drafting, Brian and I could really use this direction on where we're heading, because that's going to help us build in that roadmap. And Trace, I'll take a cue from you and Doris about how it's best to poll members.
Yep. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah, so let's do, if you're in agreement with this, if you go to your reactions button at the bottom, and give a thumbs up, we'll take note of that. Also, or raise your hand, either one. Raise your hand or thumbs up. If there are folks on a phone or you're unable to access that, you can drop it in the chat or come off mute and let us know that you're in agreement as well.
Again, this language won't be final, but this general direction is what we need to know to move forward.
I'm sorry, this is Rashan. I just want to clarify, we're talking about the draft that you sent of language, not the inherent characteristics piece that was just posted a minute ago, right? Because
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the inherent characteristic piece that was just.
Okay, okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
No problem.
I was confused what we're voting on. Thanks.
And if folks could leave their reactions up for
Actually,
a while.
yeah, you need to raise your hand. Sorry, the reactions go away. You're right. So do the raised hand and that'll stay.
So this would be in place of the longer definition. It wouldn't have the same explanatory language. It would just be this. I'm not sure I understand.
Yes, it would be in place of those very detailed provisions we put, and it would be a more broad definition going into play.
Jordan, I just want to call out what's going on in the chat, because I'm also like hesitant to vote because of that word of the use inherent. And I realize what you're saying is that this wouldn't necessarily be the exact language. However, without maybe more indication, because the idea of inherent as socioeconomic status, for example, or even race, right, as a fixed category, I just see some of those concerns coming up in the chat and just want to acknowledge that before I cast my vote to say I agree that we're moving forward in that direction.
So Yolanda, I'm going to ask for a bit of clarification there. The language isn't specific, right? And we can include the categories discussed. We're just trying to get in structural terms a broader definition or a broader exclusion, so to speak, into statute. We can come back to the language. So I really don't want folks stuck on those specific words. I'm really talking more about the method presently, not the language that I put in the chat.
Okay, so I think that's the point of question, is that you put specific language in the chat and then ask people to vote. So right. The idea of like, am I voting for language that speaks to inherent characteristics of people versus just the concept of putting something as a qualifying statement ahead of definitions?
I'm speaking to the concept. Are we comfortable moving in the concept? Again, I said that was general language. It's not stuck. I'm speaking to the concept. Are we comfortable moving forward with the concept as proposed? And again, I need hands.
I'm sorry, this is Rashan again. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble following. But so what we're agreeing to is adding this ahead of what has already been proposed. We're not talking about replacing Is that right?
We're
I'm
talking about
sorry.
replacing, instead of doing the detailed recommendation that we're kind of responding to with those sub provisions and listing out the difference between socioeconomic, we're doing a more broad concept as Stephanie proposed, getting that in there and not listing out necessarily those examples or that very specific language that we put in. Because for us to move into the warm line discussion, we do have to have some sense of what exclusions we're going to include.
I think I'm struggling because the breaking out the language is about more than just preventing discrimination, right? It's about helping people understand, I think, what isn't abuse. So I'm somewhere in the middle. I like simplification, but I don't think, and I kind of like what Jennifer said about, I think we need some more specific language to vote on, because there are other protected classes. If we are talking about discrimination, we should talk about all of them. But if we're talking about things that are, I don't know. I'm like not comfortable raising my hand, especially when a lot of experts in the field aren't raising their hands. So I don't know what to do there.
Jordan,
So I
can
just
I
want
make
to go ahead, Trace.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, can I make a suggestion that we get clear on any sort of language that you're suggesting, and also kind of what you're proposing, and then we'll put it into a form survey to the task force, because we need to move on into the next 4. But we can get clear on that, and we'll just, so I'm saying this out loud for task force members as well, that there will be a short window for you to respond to that and make clear based on what's being proposed. But that way it's a little bit more in writing, Jordan, and folks
That's
feel
fine.
comfortable. Is that okay?
I'm happy to do that. I'm going to stress very stress. Please respond to the survey. We had half participation on the survey. I need your responses to move forward. I have to do that to get us into the subcommittee work. So if we're going to go that route, please respond to the survey, because Brian and I can't draft without that general idea of where everyone is at. So I'm happy to move forward that way. We'll draft some general language. We'll draft some alternative language, but please respond to the survey so we can move forward accordingly.
We'll make it happen. I'll follow.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One thing I would say, and somebody pointed to it earlier, CDLE and CDEC, I guess, they put out rules and then they have those guidance and interpretive documents. Like, if you guys could put something like that together in this kind, I don't know that any of us are opposed to simplification, but we don't want to lose the underlying purpose of helping folks understand what is and isn't, and what's discriminatory and what isn't, and this conversation, which has been really valuable, if that makes sense.
I think what we can do, because I don't think we have enough to draft that ourselves without input from the group. I don't want to get so far down a path, not knowing what direction we want to go, that we create an entire guidance document. I can put in here what we have in this conversation, so you guys have that. We just need enough to kind of get going so I can create the agendas and the syllabi for the conversations moving forward. Like, that's why we've stuck to statute largely here. I just want to make sure we don't get so far down the path in guidance and regulatory and all of that, that we can't even get the general recommendation into play.
Yeah, can I just jump in? Sorry, my hand raiser is eluded me here. Zane, I just wanted to respond to your comment. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. It's a general non-discrimination statement. How I framed it was frankly after, a very brief reflection. And so, again, conceptually, it's about as simple as you stated it, and I appreciate the summation. And certainly we can go back, the team can go back and start trying to draft a statement that is fuller. But before we go do that, it is helpful to know, is this team going in the right direction? Because if 2 people think it's great direction and the others do not, then that makes no sense for us to go back to the drawing board for 3 hours on this thing. That is the ultimate question that I think I'm trying to understand, and would appreciate the hands up. Like, conceptually, do you approve of a general non-discrimination statement, which the team will take back and craft for your reaction in a subsequent survey? And I would also just highlight, I think we had 16 out of 33 responses in our current survey. So we really do need full participation, because otherwise, again, We go back, we spend a day and a half drafting, we come back, it's not right. It's just not a sustainable practice, frankly, to keep doing that. So Trace, respectfully, I just need to know conceptually, are people conceptually, I'm going back to conceptually, okay with this team pursuing what I'll just call a non-discriminatory statement for them to respond to in a subsequent survey? That is the question that I think we need to know.
And it's great clarification. So let's take about 30 seconds. Jill, I saw a quick thumb for you too, just for the record. I'm putting that out there.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm verbally agreeing with Illuminates. Just
Who
if
is
all it
Illuminate?
is non-discriminatory, that makes sense. But I thought the purpose of the other language was a little broader. Maybe that goes in the guidance document.
Sorry, this is Jade. I'm with Illuminate. My connection's being weird. I support this as an addition. I don't know if I like the idea of this replacing all the other stuff we've already discussed.
I just have a comment here, and I don't know if this will make it easier or just muddy the waters further, but the reason I like just kind of jumping off of this non-discrimination is because that's where we start most everything, right? In the working world, I'm thinking of as far as being an employer, you know, when I make a hire of new employees, you know, I'm protecting, you know, the law protects me from discriminating against any of these protected classes. I feel like that's almost a value statement that we're making to say, as we go forward, we're going to be very, very cautious in this committee, in this task force, to make sure that we're being mindful of these protected classes, and that we're helping the law, rewriting our suggestions into the law in a way that makes it to where these are protected classes, and it's all encompassing to me. And so I like it because it feels like if a report is being made just based on a protected status, then we kind of have our answer right then and there. If not, then I think our jobs and our work is to flesh this out even more. Okay, then what is child abuse and neglect, and definitionally how we move forward from here. So I really like having this very broad kind of, you know, these are our protected classes, and we're going to continue to protect them based on you know, that protected status. So I like it, and that's why they certainly have my vote on this, because I think it just gives us a place to jump off of, to kind of keep us in line, to make sure our as we continue to define this, that we're not flowing into those darker waters.
I just want to make sure I have a clear record. Oh, go ahead, Yolanda. Go ahead.
Right. So before I raise my hand or choose not to raise my hand, so I'm seeing also in the chat. So when you're asking for a thumbs up / raised hand around the direction, is the direction about adding this qualifying statement in place of? Because then I see what's in the chat is people aren't necessarily in support of, or they're in support of doing this, however, not in place of other language. So I just want to be really clear, like if I'm saying, yes, you all are going in the right direction, is that this type of anti-discrimination qualifying statement in place of the other examples or in addition to? Because those are two different things. So I just want to be clear on that.
Yolanda, I'll clarify, since I created this, this possibility. My intention is that this language replaces those very specific clauses that are contained in your recommendation that was submitted to everybody today. And again, my main reason for suggesting that is that to begin to narrow the definition of neglect and beginning to carve out all these different exceptions, right? Whether it's socioeconomic status, disability, we're going to miss people, right? Or again, to a lot of our colleagues' points, concern that essentially we aren't considering child impact by carving out these exceptions, right? So no, my suggestion, just to be clear with everybody, was to include this in lieu of these very detailed recommendations that exist before us today. That's my proposal.
Can I make an argument in the other direction? I think actually when we start talking about discrimination and protected classes, we're not saying we're actually not talking about the things we've spent all morning talking about. Poverty isn't a protected class. So we just spent all morning talking about it's primarily socioeconomic. These are the homelessness. Those aren't class. Like, I feel like we're starting to move in a direction that, while I support in theory, absolutely non-discrimination is important, but I feel like it undermines the work we've just done for 2 hours. And I think it simplifies the truth on the ground of, again, if we could just tell people don't discriminate, we wouldn't be in this position to have this conversation. If we could just put an overarching thing that says, hey, are you being discriminatory? Don't do that. People wouldn't do it. We have to live into the truth that people act in this way, and we need to give them clear guidance about when they're acting this way, how that's wrong. So anyhow, I'm just naming, I mean, I've voted in the chat a couple times. I'm saying, no, I don't think that we should replace it, but
Well, and I don't
it
know
feels weirdly rushed to me that we did all this for 2 hours and suddenly we're having kind of a completely different conversation. So I'm feeling a little frustrated by the request, I guess. So not the argument, because Stephanie, I think the dialogue is important. I'm saying I think the voting feels confusing to me what we're right now, but I have voted, so I'll stop talking.
No, and I appreciate that, Roshan. Let me just again clarify. I'm using the term non-discriminatory in a very broad context here. And that is why I said, should we have the team going back to start drafting language around this concept, which does not in any way eliminate the conversations, meaning that we shouldn't be making child abuse reports based on a variety of different status or conditions. That is my proposal. And so, yes, I used race and ethnicity and disability initially, but I absolutely think it incorporates, frankly, a year's worth of discussions, which includes, whether that's homelessness or, other conditions. So again, conceptually, I'm just trying to move us to a point of what we want to see versus trying to exclude every possibility from every case or every story that all of us can bring to this discussion, because that's where I find myself really struggling. So no, and I don't want to suggest, Roshan, that none of the rest of the stuff for the last hour or year doesn't matter. That wasn't my intention anyway.
Correct. And if I can just speak to process, these discussions will be included heavily in our report. That's why we have them. That's why we listed them out piece by piece, so we can note the points of tension, where we're hitting, what's coming in, and how we got to this point. So there's certainly not lost effort by moving this way. The intention, at least for myself and the individual who's partnering with Brian to draft this language, is even after our discussion today, we don't have a clear sense of where to go. And I really want to emphasize we're running out of time on some of this. And so we just need a clear direction for where for us to go so we can keep this moving forward. And that's not an intention to rush, but if we see a moment when we can potentially grapple onto something and build off of it, that's why we're coming back and asking for polls and asking where we want to do this and why we're doing surveys, because I know a year sounds like a long time, but this is going to go really, really quickly. And we're acutely aware that we need to get drafting and that you guys need this information to move forward. So we're not trying to rush, but process-wise, I'm just hearing a lot of different positions. Like, we agree with it here, but we don't know how to draft it. So to get you guys something to respond to, I just need to be very clear about where we stand. That's sincerely my intention. I'm not trying to rush anyone, but this is that process to move forward. So Therese, if you're okay, I'm seeing hands going up and down, and I would just like to potentially just take a roll so I can make my notes clear to myself, if you're okay with that.
Yep.
Okay, so as Stephanie has stated, in replace of, but broad enough to include all the items we've been talking about, conceptually, are you in favor of moving forward in that direction? I'm just going to go down the list. Dawn?
Yes.
Yolanda?
I'm abstaining from the vote.
Kevin? Kevin, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute, Kevin.
Spacebar. I am not for replacing it. I like it in addition to, as a guiding principle with specific examples.
Has Sam joined us?
No.
Has Carlos joined us? No. Ashley Chase?
Sorry, I'm driving. I can never figure out how to get off mute. I'm okay with the concept. It's hard to know without seeing the actual language. So, but I would like to see it, and then we can go from there if we need to fill it out more.
And that's all we're asking is if we're okay to head in this range for drafting. Jill?
Yes.
Thank you. Carrie for Michelle?
Yes.
Jessica Daughter?
Yes.
Tara?
Uh,
Yes.
I'm gonna, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I didn't know if you said Sarah, Tara.
I'm sorry, I said Tara Doxtator?
Yes, I'm in agreement.
Thank you. Ida?
Yes.
Jennifer?
I think she said yes.
Oh. Yes.
Yeah, your audio's not working, Jennifer, for some reason.
Yeah, Jennifer, can you drop it in the chat just for the record and then keep moving, Jordan?
Thank you. Leanna? We lost Leanna. Thane?
Yes.
Thank you. Nate, has Nate joined us? Adriana?
I support its inclusion, but I would prefer to keep the 4 characteristics defined.
Thank you. Lori? Has Lori joined us? Shayna? Shauna?
I support the inclusion, but needing more detail.
So that's a yes to go forward with drafting?
Correct.
Gina? We lost Gina?
I think we did. Oh no, Gina's.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Oh, there
now we
you are.
can.
Yes.
Thank you. Chris?
Yes.
Michelle Murphy?
Yes.
Margaret?
Yes.
Colleen? Absent?
Not here.
Sarah? Sorry for the confusion earlier.
No worries. Yes.
Thank you. Roshan?
No, as I said, as an overarching or an introduction, yes, but I want to keep the examples as well.
Casey? Actually, Casey's in the waiting room, so I will come back. Dr. Wells?
Yes.
Thank you. Donna?
Yes.
Kelsey? Kelsey absent?
Absent, not seeing her, but Casey's in now.
Casey, have you heard the discussion?
No, sorry, friends. Balancing the sick kid and all of the joys of that.
Casey, I'll set up a separate time to circle up with you and we'll go from there.
Great, thank you.
Jade?
Yes to draft, but I think I still like it as an addition.
Stephanie?
Yes.
All right, thank you all, and I will hand it back over to Doris and Trace.
Yeah, and Jordan, just before we move on real quickly. So the reason I just want to articulate, Jordan, the reason you got the vote is that you will be collecting, if you will, votes who want yes to promote this language we've discussed further, as well as votes where I'm okay with this language in addition to the other concepts that were contained in today's discussion, because that was asked by Yolanda, I believe.
Yep, I've caught both. So if you stated that if you want it in addition to, not in lieu of, I've made a record of that, so it's clear. If anyone would like to amend based on that, please let me know now. I've also noted the no's and the abstention.
Great. And then I guess my subsequent question is, for those who want this language in addition to other provisions that were articulated in today's document, I think it would be helpful for those individuals to tell us which of those provisions, right, that they want, in addition to this new language that is being drafted. Because right now, I don't know what that means in terms of specific details, right? I think some of us have said we love provision 1, but not 2 and 3, and so I guess I'm just asking for those individuals who voted in an and both capacity to what, Jordan, talk to you and Brian, send their emailed language, suggestions, timeframes for that work, et cetera, because I want to make sure that we capture the totality of their voices as well.
So I think what honestly I would like to do is, because we're going to start working on this quickly today, I'm literally going to go through. First, I want to see, is there anyone who wants to change their vote from yes to yes in addition to? Then I want to go through person by person and make sure I know which provisions are included.
Jordan, if it's okay, I want to be clear. That's why I abstained, because you didn't give us an option of yes in addition to. You said the vote was a yes if this is going to take the place of the other provisions and examples. That was what people were voting for. So it's a yes, no, or abstain, not a yes and I want it to be in addition to. So it doesn't feel like a clean vote, because if what you were stating was this qualifying statement, anti-discrimination statement, is in place of, then the people who voted yes in addition to, that's not a true yes vote. And so I just want to be clear, because that's why I will continue to abstain from that voting, because it just, I'm sorry if I'm creating a barrier or a challenge here. I don't know if those of you that voted yes and as an addition to, that's not what I heard was the vote for. So I don't believe that that's a true yes.
So Yolanda, I just stated I'm going to go back through, and anyone who wants to change their vote into that position, I will make a note, and I'm glad to take down what needs to be included. We're working our best to get through this and to get to a position, so I appreciate everyone's patience as we work through this. Again, these are recorded, they'll be reflected in whole, but that's why we just said we're going to go back through and do that. So I'm going to go back through the list of yes to see if you want to move into that position, and then I'm asking specifically what you would like included and defined. Is everyone okay with that? Great. Dawn, you voted yes. Would you like to do in addition to or in lieu of?
In lieu of.
Thank you. Yolanda.
I will continue to abstain.
Kevin, you stated in addition to. Would you like to list the examples?
I liked all the examples with the caveat that the survey one, that last one about resources, I just think that the language needs to be about community and culturally relevant resources given to folks. And I don't remember, and I apologize if I missed that conversation.
No, you haven't, Kevin. Thank you. That's helpful. Ashley, you voted yes. Are you in lieu of or in addition to?
In lieu of.
Thank you.
For now.
Jill, are you in lieu of or addition to?
In addition to, and I'm happy to comment further, in the survey about language, because I think that there's a lot of options there.
That's okay. Generally, would you like us to move forward with all of them? Because for me to draft, I generally have to know what people are trying to include.
I would want to be overly inclusive then.
Okay, thank you. Carrie, for Michelle, you voted yes. Are you in addition to or in lieu of?
In addition, excuse me, in addition to all.
Thank you. Jessica Daughter, are you in lieu of or in addition to?
It's tough. I'm going to go with in lieu of, knowing that we have a lot more work and more discussion to do on each side of things. But that's what I'll go with now.
I'll make a note that it's knowing additional discussion is happening. Tara Doxtator, are you in lieu of or in addition to?
I think I'm in addition to all of, including all of it.
Thank you. Ida, are you in lieu of or in addition to?
In addition to all the characteristics.
Jennifer, you noted in addition to. What would you like to include?
as comprehensive as possible.
Zane, you noted yes. Are you in lieu of or in addition to?
In lieu of.
Adriana, you noted in addition to. What additional characteristics would you like us to know?
In the survey, I preferred to combine characteristics 1 and 2, but I'm open to keeping all and continuing those discussions.
Gina, you noted yes. Are you in lieu of or in addition to?
Addition to and all.
Thank you. Shauna, you noted yes. Are you in lieu of or in addition to?
In addition to and supportive of all there, knowing that there'll be continued wordsmithing there.
Chris, you noted yes. Are you in addition to or in lieu of?
In lieu of.
Thank you. Michelle Murphy, you noted yes. Are you in addition to or lieu of?
In lieu of.
Thank you, Michelle. Margaret?
In lieu of.
Okay. Sarah, you said yes. Are you in addition to or in lieu of?
In addition to all.
Roshan, you have voted no. Would you like to remain no, or would you like to move to in addition to?
I know I still feel confused by the choices. I think I'll keep my no because it doesn't. But I appreciate the shift that people are making, and Yolanda, I appreciate your point too. It feels muddy to me what we're agreeing to or not still.
Dr. Wells, you said yes. Are you in lieu of or in addition to?
In lieu of, with that it can be as comprehensive as possible. I think we want to see what could be produced. The other thing, well, I have a comment after the vote's done.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Thank you, Dr. Wells. Donna, you noted yes. Are you in lieu of or in addition to?
In lieu of.
Thank you. Jade?
In addition to currently all, and once the language is drafted, I might change that position because I do think it's going to be really in the details of how the words are written.
Great, thanks, Jade. Stephanie, in lieu of or in addition to?
In lieu of.
Thank you. Dr. Wells, we'll go back to you.
Yeah, I was just gonna make a little bit of a plea, given that this is that if it was possible to get something drafted and out, and this group can make a commitment to give some sort of response or reaction to that as soon as possible, because I suspect it's gonna have a lot to do with how the planning is for our next meeting together, and that making that as most the best use of time as possible, it seems to me, and I don't mean to speak for the support team, but it seems to me if that's possible and everyone could agree to a shorter timeline to respond, then it might give more direction for our next meeting.
Yeah, Dr. Wells, Brian and I will literally reconvene after this meeting and start putting our heads together. Again, there's a lot to put together here, and we'll do our best to do the definitions, and then we'll respond in the survey. We're going to have to reconsider the timing for some of the subsequent conversations on how to make space for this. So we'll put our heads together and do that as well.
Seeing Ashley with her hand raised. Go ahead, Ashley.
Thanks, Trace. I'm imagining that the facilitation team might be somewhat frustrated because we were given a lot of opportunity to weigh in on this, and I know that it looks like maybe didn't, although I will say I thought I did. And I think what happens, especially this time of year for me, and I apologize, it's legislative session, I think I pulled it up once or twice, and I have no way of checking whether I actually did it or not. So I don't know if whatever form we're using where we weigh in, if there's a way to get a confirmation or a way to double check and see if we did it or not. That might be helpful, Trace, just for us to be more responsible to you guys, because I know that I wasn't sure. So and maybe there is a way and I just didn't know how to check, but that would be, I think, helpful just to make sure we're doing what we need to do for you.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Ashley. All right, Jordan, do you have what you need?
I do. Thanks, Trace.
Okay. I'm gonna before we Doris, I'm going to throw to you to keep going, but I'm just going to name that there's some tension and frustration in the room. So just going to encourage us to take a deep breath. I know we're all speaking from a place of care and passion and concern, and we want to make sure that our points are heard. So certainly some lessons learned on the facilitation side, and we're listening, and I really appreciate everybody willing to be vulnerable when you're feeling frustrated about things. So just want to name that. We got 30 minutes left, and this is an amazing group with a lot of expertise. And so just hang in there with us. Doris, I'm going to bring you back in, and let's keep rolling.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Trace. And thank you all for, sort of being open to the pivot, even if you weren't super excited about it, to get Jordan and Brian some additional definite direction for all of you to react to. And Stephanie, I'm seeing your note in the chat. Just appreciating the dialogue. We know this work is hard. I consider all adaptive work messy. And so we're in the messiness of it all. So the next 4 items that we'll talk through, and I know that we only have now 28 minutes, are really focused on providing some clarification for some of the conversation that we've already had. So this first clarification point is around solely or also in and of themselves. So really trying to narrow in on what is meant by a particular exclusion. And so this clarification is about in enacting and implementing this amendment, care should be taken to ensure the following clarification that this amendment neither implies that circumstances involving the 4 specified characteristics can never contribute to child abuse or neglect, nor that such circumstances may never be considered in such investigations. Instead, the amendment instills in statute that these 4 named characteristics do not constitute neglect in and of themselves. So for those of you who are worried about like sort of the totality of circumstances that a child or family might be in, this is trying to get at really that point of using the language solely for the different characteristics. So some of the feedback that we received in the survey, and we'll then invite all of you to add some additional thinking and reflections on this clarification. I support this only if it is not a deterrent by mandatory reporters. The way the 4 characteristics currently read, I was unsure if they are an and or, and I'm sure we will continue to noodle on how the characteristics are defined in this next set of iteration that Jordan and Brian will undertake and bring back to this group. The additional comment on in and of themselves still allows for workarounds and for the opportunity for there to be for the system to harm folks from marginalized communities and identities, and concerns that broadly excluding indigence, even if it's not fault of the parent, may have a harmful impact on the child. So similar to Zane's comment in that indigence characteristic, some concern about, still attending to the needs of the family. But I think to some of the earlier conversation, this is an attempt to clarify what solely means and how the characteristics should be considered in the law. So with that, I want to open it up for questions or additional commentary, reflections on this particular clarification. All right, I don't see any hands raised or anyone coming off mute. All right, gonna keep moving. I'm getting dizzy. Clarification 2 is around physical and sexual abuse. So clarifying that this amendment does not negate the duties or responsibilities of professionals or mandatory reporters to respond in circumstances of physical abuse or sexual abuse. So as you may or may not recall, those characteristics we're specific to, we're most aligned with neglect, the neglect classification. And those categories, those characteristics tend to fall under that particular classification of report. Feedback from the survey, I don't believe this is necessary, and I think it will result in continued reports in these circumstances. It seems like the first few amendments should be for just neglect, or specifically about what type of abuse that could apply. This question on discussing who are mandatory reporters, and then some language edits, circumstances of known or suspected physical or sexual abuse. So adding some language here for clarification. All right, now we got some action. Jessica and then Jennifer.
Thank you. So reminder, Jessica Donner representing prosecuting attorneys, right? So my viewpoint on this is that it is really important as clarification in our recommendations, kind of along the same lines of comments that Zane was making earlier, and that a number of people have referenced, you know, that these exceptions when it's abuse and neglect are not solely due to these, that doesn't change, right? That reporters need to take action when they have concerns about physical abuse, right? And physical abuse, I think most people understand and can agree on that it means like there's physical injury, or when there's sexual abuse, right? And so clearly that's coming from the child safety viewpoint that we have. And from prosecutors, we want to ensure that mandatory reporters are not confused and thinking, well, I don't have to report this because, you know, maybe this sexual abuse is tied to poverty because there's 10 people in the household and there's not enough supervision over the, you know, one juvenile on another juvenile, and that's why the sex abuse occurred. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think it's just, for me, looking at making this point in the recommendations that we're making is important. Again, in that same kind of lane as that when we submit this report, it will be guiding legislators regards to important pieces that they should be considered or considering when they're drafting changes to the child abuse. Again, that long run, this is not telling them exactly what to say. To me, this is a clarification that says you should consider this, legislators, in making recommendations. And yes, I agree with Chris, emotional abuse is often, I totally agree and would add to adding emotional abuse to this clarification. She can talk more about that, but I do think that it's simply understated and often overlooked as well.
Thank you, Jessica. Jennifer, and then we'll come to you, Jill, in the chat.
So I don't believe this is necessary. As I said in the survey, this really belongs in the mandatory reporter statute, and the mandatory reporter statute already says known or suspected abuse or neglect. So and I actually feel this way about the previous thing, and I didn't comment because I just feel kind of stuck in this place of trying to think about the language of the mandatory reporting statute, the difficulties we're having there. The reason I'm here to advocate on behalf of folks who are working with victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and how our current system fails them and harms them. This just feels out of place and unnecessary, and I think that's all I want to say about it.
Thank you, Jennifer. And then Jessica noted in the chat, a reminder that almost all the failures to report over the last 10 years have been for physical or sexual abuse. And my additional commentary, most of the over-reporting of, families just that have maybe fallen on hard times is in the neglect category. And then what did I want to Jessica, do you still have your hand up, or were you gonna add something?
Oh, nope, I just need to lower it. Thank you.
Okay, no worries, thank you. Jill, I wanted to see if you can bring your voice into the comment that you put in the chat, agreeing with Jennifer's comment, and not believing it's necessary as a standalone.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read it in a bit, but Stephanie has talked a little bit about like why we're here. And one of the main, this is just not why we're here. Like this is what mandated reporters generally report. What we're trying to prevent is for them mistakenly reporting things that are not necessary to report. I don't think anybody here is saying that we're trying to change the statute to make it harder to report physical or sexual abuse, and I don't think it needs a carve out. I think the things that are technically challenging around like sexual abuse could be related to if it's, the situations that, the attorneys have prosecuted or tried to prosecute around, a 19-year-old having a relationship with a high school student, or sexting, or things that we're not talking about with the sentence. Those are challenging, but this sentence and this clarification does not help any mandated reporter understand how to better report sexual abuse. And I don't think we need to highlight it since it's already part of the statute.
Thank you for that, Jill. I think so. I don't want to speak for Jordan, but I think Jordan and Brian, I think one of the reasons for providing this clarification is sort of in my mind an if then. So if there is a clarification around what no longer constitutes neglect, some explicit language that says that doesn't then negate requirements or expectations around physical and sexual abuse. So I think that it's indicated here separately, but I think at the same time we want to be thinking about each of these clarifications in the broader context of the conversation around those exceptions.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Doris. Again, in our last meeting, there was a little bit of confusion discussion about how this was going to interplay with physical and sexual abuse. And so when we name something explicitly like this in a survey, it's to get that very concise conversation about where we're at, where the group finds this, and how we can consider it. So it was really to tie a bow on that conversation a couple weeks ago.
Thank you, Jordan. Any other thoughts, concerns, questions around this clarification? All right, we'll move on to clarification 3, which is around clearly communicated training. I mentioned earlier that we would get to this training component, and we had a few comments on here, but this speaks to, any related changes in the statute and regulation should be clearly communicated to a broad range of stakeholders in the child protection system, including mandatory reporters, and incorporated into required training and professional development. So again, this complementary call out to the need for there to be, training that captures the changes and also any new or nuanced expectations. Some of the feedback from the survey, questions or concerns around broad range of stakeholders not being defined. Another comment around the vagueness such that it may not have much weight, and also get to a good place around defining who are reporters. So I think some nod to the complexity of there being other references and needing to maybe provide some clarity around who are reporters, which is an intent to address fear-based reporting of families that we know causes harm both to those families and the communities. So I'd love to open it up and hear from folks, both those who did respond to the survey and importantly, those who did not, on questions, concerns, or things that you really like about including this particular clarification. Jennifer?
I think one of our charges as a task force has been training of mandatory reporters, right? Like that's part of what we are supposed to do. I actually think this is counter to that, in a sense, where if we need to address the fact that all mandatory reporters need to be trained, they need to be trained on their obligations from start to finish and this whole process. We know that's been a huge problem. We know that's what's caused some of the lack of reporting in some of the situations that I think Jessica in particular has been referring to. So just referring to changes as needing to be communicated and there to be training, I don't think is sufficient. And I actually think we need to address this differently.
Yeah, I think the plan is to so the proposal here is to offer this clarifying note to the extent that the task force wants to include it. But that doesn't then negate actually doing this deep work around mandatory reporter training that is still a task of the task force. So this would be in addition to that specific body of work and recommendations that come from that conversation. Jessica, I see your hand up.
Thank you. And I have kind of a question, but slash maybe an example. I was taking these kind of clarifications to be directly related to these particular exceptions, right? We're not talking broadly in terms of everything that we're going to be doing according to the task force mandates, but that these are referring directly to these. So, you know, yes, there are lots more to be covered, but that's how I was taking it. And to maybe give an example of how I think that can be really helpful in guiding practitioners and guiding legislators, obviously, as is our goal. I sit on the Sex Offender Management Board. We write the guidelines for standards and treatment regarding sex offenders after they've been convicted. And one thing we do is we say, here's what should be done. And then, you know, there's oftentimes nuances there and clarifications, and we put a discussion point and we say, you know what, this is something you should discuss while you're going through your practice. So I see these clarifications as discussion points for the legislature to be considering when they're reviewing our report as in, you know, as a whole, but that these points directly relate to just these exceptions that we've been discussing over the last few meetings.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
All right, continuing to scan my little boxes. We have about 12 minutes left.
Hey, Doris, this is
Yes.
Gina.
Hi, Gina.
I just want, hi. My connection's not wanting to work with me, so I had to lose the camera. But so this is why I'm struggling with this piece. I do believe that training is important, but I also have, I struggle with how do we get mandated reporters trained when everyone under the sun seems to think they're a mandated reporter? I mean, I guess that's just where I'm struggling with it, and we're probably working on this going forward still, but I'm just struggling with this and in the survey, like giving you all something to work with there. So I also apologize to that, but I just have a hard time with it because yes, training's important. And also, like, you know, if everybody feels that they're reporters, I mean, is that possible that everybody gets this training? And and I have to say, no, that's not possible. No, they're not. And I agree, Jennifer, but like in in the community, I mean, I've just run into this over and over again. We have like after school programs, we have like specific community, like, and, you know, programming for young folks. And these are all volunteers. These are people who are volunteers. And I hear over and over and over again that they're like, well, I'm a mandated reporter. I'm a mandated reporter 24/7. And it's like, well, I don't know about that. I mean, I volunteer for some of these things, and like in the context of events and activities, yes, obviously, you know, I will do that, but 24/7 in my professional capacity, where I'm not a mandated reporter. And so again, I just feel like it's so important for us to get some clarity here for folks. And this is where I have a hard time with us, like trying to assign these things that are important, like training, where we still haven't helped our community understand, like, you know, are you a mandated reporter 24/7? Like, you know, all of that. And I just, yeah, so I'm just struggling with this in terms of making sure we're hitting all of those pieces, so we're not, you know, we're not clouding up the system. We're not, you know, we're not missing folks that should get this information. Anyways, that's just where my comment came from. Thanks.
Thank you, Gina. And I think that your comment is applicable, not just in thinking about this particular clarification, but also as this group then moves into grappling with the training piece, you know, what might need to be some key recommendations under training. So thank you for adding that.
And
So I
just
want to
to-
make,
oh,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Gina, I did want to answer your question on whether or not we'll be hitting this directly, and the answer to that is yes. One of the directives that we're required to consider moving forward in subcommittee is that scope of the duty and that notification of the duty. So again, in that iterative process, that is coming up. So just to give you some ease, we will be hitting that point, I think, closer to April or May. Sorry, Doris.
Thanks, Jordan. No problem. That was a great clarification. So we're going to move over to the last clarification and then wrap up for today. Looking to see, doesn't look like there are any members of the public who have made mention of wanting to testify. So we might be able to take this right up to the top of the hour. So this clarification is around services and resources. And some of this conversation, I think, came up. But clarification that the identification of the 4 specified characteristics does not imply there is no need for mandatory reporter or public entity action. Instead of making a report regarding child abuse and neglect, in these instances, individuals and or entities should consider how available services and resources may aid the child and or family without prompting an investigation of child abuse and or neglect. The state, county, or other entity is encouraged to both ensure the availability of such services and resources and simplify, improve referral and access processes for such services and resources. So again, that was a mouthful. But this idea of there being a potential alternative path that has not yet been fleshed out, that is part of the charge of this task force. But so in the instance that a report to the hotline may not be necessary in these instances, that doesn't necessarily absolve the reporter of all responsibility for doing anything. And so this is an attempt to get at potentially connecting families then to alternative paths, like a warm line, or accessing services in a different way. So this is putting the onus on reporters to some of the feedback from the survey. It puts the onus on reporters to find services for families. Maybe not. I'm hopeful with the warm line concept being possible that this can be referenced in the statute change. So there may be some connection to the work that we have yet upcoming. I would take out mandatory reporter from the first sentence. Point E adds a bit of confusion and appears to make things subjective again. Consider whether the family is already engaged in services, resources, etc. is what I would change. Encouraged is a difficult one for me. Can you scroll? I don't know if it's up or down, just so I can see more of the sheet. Thank you. Clarification that the identification of the 4 specified characteristics does not imply there is no need for mandatory reporter or public entity action. Individuals and or entities should consider how available culturally responsive services and resources may aid the child and or family without prompting an investigation of child abuse or neglect. Like the idea of this language, there's a difference between these circumstances being the basis of a finding of abuse or neglect versus what a mandatory reporter must analyze before making a report. I'd like to be sure that mandatory reporters easily understand that it's not expected that they analyze this beyond the simple reasonable cause to know or suspect, or whatever language we come up with, such as know or suspect. That was a whole lot, and we have 5 minutes left. So would love to hear from those of you in particular who did not respond to the survey, just your reflection on this language. Roshan?
Yeah, I would go back to some of the conversation we had last meeting around looking at the medical mandated, like the changes to the mandated reporting statute for medical folks in DB in terms of not, because I agree that until we have something to actually, so I agree if we don't have a warm line or some kind of training, I don't think just telling people consider is enough. So I would actually, so I would like there to be a place do we actually send folks. So I know that's coming. I just want to reiterate that. And two, if we have that, I think something like what's in that statute that says you actually have to make that connection, or document that you made that connection, which is what's in the medical, might be a helpful way to actually acknowledge that this happened, because I don't want people to drop through drop out of support, but I also don't want them to get into harmful systems. So
awesome. Thank you, Roshan. Others? I see, Gina, you put something in the chat. You'd like more accountability, that those folks are making those connections or efforts to connect families to resources. Thank you for adding that. And I see a thumbs up from Kevin. Y'all are exhausted from this discussion, aren't you?
Yeah. That's what I'm seeing. Head nods.
They're like, we got 3 minutes left. Do we want to go over?
I teed up exit music. Don't worry.
Fantastic. So we got a lot done. We squeezed in a pivot in there to reconsider some of the language around what I would call the exceptions. But we got a lot done. And I know that this work is messy. And messy and exhausting because it's complex. We're talking about really complex issues. And we know that on the other side of that is real and significant impacts to kids, families, and communities. And so appreciate all of you for the rich discussion, for the frustration and the disagreement, and finding places of commonality, the use of the chat and the voiceover. I think that Jordan and Brian have a lot to wade through and noodle on to bring something back that further refines the thinking of this group and distills it down in a way that is digestible to all of you. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Trace.
Yeah, and I'll just invite Stephanie in for any closing comments as chair. And I was just looking at our calendar. We're back very soon on February 7th. So that's my heads up there. But Stephanie, close us out, please.
Yeah, I just really a great, robust conversation. Thank you all for all the different perspectives from your various lens that you look through and the seats where you sit. I just want to reiterate what Doris said. I know many of us have partaken in many of these task force-like circumstances, and all I can say is the work's not getting done unless you're having the hard conversations. And honestly, I think somebody hit on it today, but if it were easy, it would have been solved 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We know that there have been problems for 30 years, right? So I think this group, honestly, it's courageous. It's courageous to come forward and tackle a subject of this magnitude that has such broad impact. And so I just want to tell you, thank you for your courage. Thank you for your innovation. Thank you for your struggle. And would also just say, please participate as fully as you can, right? Your words, your ideas, put pen to paper, because we certainly will benefit from you. So just thank you all. It's good to see you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you back on the 7th.